life, this absurd situation we find ourselves in of knowing so little about what we eat. And I was really curious to find how we got into that situation. And in Kitchen Literacy, I didn't really analyze policies or technologies, but rather I chose to focus on telling stories that illuminated this matter of what we know about what we eat. Because I think the history, the stories, get us to think afresh about this in our own lives.
That was author Ann Vileisis, and this is Jennifer Pullinger, e-content editor at Island Press. Thanks for joining us again for another edition of Island Press Podcasts. You can find all of our past and present podcasts at our website located at www.islandpress.org. You are what you eat, right? But do you really know what you're eating, or at least where it came from? In Kitchen Literacy, historian Ann Vileisis says through the years, Americans have become disconnected from the sources of their food and how it got to their plate. Beginning in 18th century kitchens and progressing to modern-day supermarkets, Kitchen Literacy chronicles how we've lost intimate knowledge of our foods and how we can get it back. Ann joined us by phone recently from her home in Port Orford, Oregon. How would you describe America's relationship with food today compared to years ago?
A quick and dirty answer is that today we have, I think, a fast and dysfunctional relationship with food, whereas in the past, about 200 years ago, we probably had a very slow and straightforward relationship with food. In my book, Kitchen Literacy, I really focus not so much on our relationship with food, but how we know our food. And so in the past, back in pre-industrial America, it was really possible for people to know quite a lot, very specifically, about the places and particulars of where their foods came from and how they were raised, about the stories of their foods, where today this is really virtually impossible to know about our foods. Of course, there's so many wonderful things about our food system today. It provides us with food in an incredibly cheap and convenient manner. But there's another side to this story, and that is that we no longer know where our foods come from at all.
And why was it important to take a look back at history?
Well, I think looking back at history gives us an opportunity to freshen our perspective. By looking at stories of how people knew about their foods in the past, it enables us to think differently about what we know today. For example, today we think things like calories or carbohydrates in our foods are very important things to know. But if you go back in time, a couple hundred years ago, people, of course, didn't even know or think about these things at all. Instead, they knew things like the very specific stories of animals that became their meats or of the vegetables that they were going to be cooking with. And so they had a very different expectation about what was important to know about foods. And that, of course, changed as the food system industrialized and our foods came to us in different ways. And I think looking at the history of how this change in our thinking about foods, how this change in our expectation about foods occurred, sheds just fresh light on how we approach this question today in our everyday lives. And it's just interesting to reflect upon.
Which does lead us to today, especially how marketing is pervasive. How has food marketing affected how we eat?
Well, one of the things I found very interesting in my research is when I went back and looked at the period when the food system began to industrialize, really the turn of the last century, when products like canned foods and boxed cereals and margarine, all these things came into being for the first time, was really the same time that the advertising industry came into being. And really, the two developed hand in hand. The advertising industry cut its teeth helping to ease Americans into new ways of thinking about foods. And the crucial thing to understand is that advertising helps to shape what we think is important to know about foods. And if you go back and look at very early promotions and early advertising, it tended to reflect the traditional expectations people had to know where and how their foods were created. But over time, as food production became less appetizing, advertising shifted our attention away from those places and particulars of production towards more emotional and personal contexts of how foods were raised. And so we started thinking about foods not in the context of where they were coming from, but more in terms of how do they please me? What are these foods doing for me? How do they make me feel? All sorts of emotional things that ads play upon. It's a very interesting topic.
And what do you make of the growing popularity of organic food in farmers markets today?
Well, I think the tremendous groundswell of interest in local agriculture, farmers markets, and organic foods definitely is a response to this period when we had such a difficult time knowing our foods. Basically, organic foods and local foods give us a chance to know the stories of our foods once again in a very real way, and I think that's one of the reasons people are finding shopping in these new ways to be very rewarding.
And is knowing your food a personal decision, or do you believe there is a role for government?
Well, you know, it's a very personal thing, certainly, because knowing what we eat and making decisions about what we eat is just something we do in our everyday lives. It really seems very personal. And the stories that I tell in my book, Kitchen Literacy, about the history of this is very much based on what we as individuals do and know. But, of course, there's also a role for public policy because the choices we make, of course, are made in a larger context. There are farm policies, agricultural policies, and policies that have to do with advertising that affect the kinds of choices that we have. And so the movement right now of consumerism, green consumerism, of the effort of people trying to buy things to have an impact in this capitalistic society, market-driven society we live in, is very important. But, of course, public policy is incredibly important, too, and I think the two can work together to move agriculture and food production in ways that we need them to move.
And what advice would you give a busy household on how they can better know the food that they eat?
I think today there's some really exciting options for people, for home cooks who are wanting to know their foods better. Certainly, people can buy organic foods and know with reasonable certainty that because of organic certification, that these foods are raised in ways that pay greater attention to soil and land and water stewardship. Even more exciting, perhaps, is shopping at farmers markets. There's a groundswell of farmers markets all across America. This gives people an opportunity to support local farms, agriculture that tends to require less fossil fuel because there's less transportation involved. Foods are fresher, more delicious, more nutritious, get people excited about cooking in this healthy foods in this age of epidemic obesity. So there's lots of, and I think they give a new kind of food security as well, based on a more regional, local agriculture. Another really exciting thing that people can do is join CSA, community-supported agriculture. These are subscription farms where city dwellers can sign up with a farm and get fresh vegetables delivered all through the growing season. This gives people an opportunity to meet farmers, to understand how their food is grown, and to know firsthand that their food is coming from people that they trust.
You can find out more about kitchen literacy and author Ann Vileisis by visiting our website at www.islandpress.org.